spell out some of the is to spell out some of the building blocks for what I aim at, namely to rethink the idea of progress and to rethink it through while making productive a Hegelian mode of analyzing and normatively evaluating history. So the broader project here is a book that has been overdue already with the title of Progress and Regression, which is also somehow a follow-up to my previous book on the critique of forms of life, since the previous book somehow ends with the idea that in order to criticize forms of life, we should have a look at the way they develop through crisis-driven learning processes. And the idea here is that some kind of an accumulative plot, an accumulative narrative is available through which we could judge this on, let's say, less substantive grounds than if we would come up with a full-blown ethical theory or a full-blown theory about what is good or what is substantially needed within human forms of life. The other way around, this means that I'm somehow dependent on some idea of some notion of progress, and again, seen from, let's say, the other end of the tunnel, it is important here for me to develop this idea of an accumulative process of experience and an accumulative learning process, and to defend it against some of the well-known critiques that also are frequently brought up against Hegel's philosophy of history, the kind of critiques we find in the post-colonial critique of progress and of teleological understandings of history. Obvious objections like the charges of teleology, of historical determinism, and as it is the Eurocentrism that, at least in Hegel's version, seems to be so prominent. So it might appear a bit curious or misguided to, out of all aspects, to try to defend this kind of a philosophy of history, since those problems have rightfully been spelled out, and the accusations become even stronger when you have a look, for example, at the discussion about Hegel's racism and its inherent connections to the kind of Eurocentrism and teleological history of progress that is at stake here. What I find productive, though, in Hegel is that he provides us with a model of analyzing as well as criticizing social change. So I find the way he conceptualizes social change as a crisis-driven history, as well as the way this analysis is intertwined with the normative resources. And this again is something that I just want to hint at, because it's some of the background of my attempt. I think that a critical theory is actually in need of this kind of normativity, as it is intertwined with a certain normative understanding of history. There are only so many alternatives how to establish normative grounds for a critical theory. And this, the project of this kind of immanent critique, as it is linked through to this crisis-driven history, is something that seems, at least from the perspective of a certain kind of critical theory, something that we can't easily or that we should give a serious thought while pursuing the idea that there might be a non-Eurocentric and path-dependent plural idea of progress or a cumulative learning process that at the same time gives us criteria of progressiveness as a certain criterion for emancipatory social change. So the idea here is to somehow save elements of Hegel's philosophy of history with respect to spelling out progressiveness as a criterion for social change. But again, this is only the background story here. What I'm going to do in this talk is to spell out some of the building blocks and to somehow free Hegel from some of the obvious accusations that are around. So Hegel is the thinker of history in more than one respect, and as a thinker of history is also the thinker of crisis. He is the philosopher who placed the fact that existing social institutions and practices are the result of an ongoing historical dynamic, understood as a dynamics of crisis at the center of his thought. But moreover, Hegel also regards the rationality of social or ethical formations as something that has developed historically, something that is the result of the history. In very broad terms, rationality in this instance becomes historicized. It is the property, as he says, of self-conscious reasonableness, Vernunft, as Hegel explains with regard to the history of philosophy, a legacy and more precisely the result of labor, namely the labor of all preceding generations of humanity, that has to be reflexively appropriated for each of them. History, on the other hand, is interpreted as a dynamic process and should be seen as a realization of such a historically mediated rationality. Thus, if rationality is conceived as something that is historical in nature, history in turn is something that is rational from a certain perspective. This is precisely the view that separates Hegel both from an ahistorical universalism and from a relativistic historicism, which is to say he neither holds the position that any historical form of life abides by its own law, hence eluding the possibility of a comparative ethical assessment, nor would he argue that the rationality and the truth of a social form of life could be judged on eternally valid normative grounds outside of that life's context. What Hegel seems to have in mind is rather the possibility of what we might call rational paradigm change. It is actually paradigms that change throughout history. This change, however, is not an irrational shift from one paradigm to the other, but a dialectical process to which we can attribute an inherent logic, namely the accumulative tendency of a learning process or an enrichment in experience. This course of an accumulating process of experience is, of course, paradigmatically explored in the phenomenology of spirit. In it, consciousness in a process of reflection on its own inadequacy shifts from one incomplete self-understanding, inhibited by self-deception, to the next. But it can be claimed that such a progression to a greater or lesser degree also underlies the developmental process outlined in his philosophy of history. There, the rise and fall of historical civilizations from the high cultures of Asia to ancient Greece up to Hegel's own time appear as stages in a process that can be interpreted as a development of social formations that, viewed by Hegel from the perspective of reason, arise successively from one another, and in which the principle of the consciousness of freedom is unfolded. But this consciousness of freedom is not unfolded on its own steam. The transformation process that it describes is facilitated both by crisis and their overcoming. In both the philosophy of history and the phenomenology of spirit, it is the untenable and contradictory nature of an existing position that drives it beyond itself. It is thus the destabilization and erosion of existing institutions, practices, social formations, and forms of life that lead to their eventual demise and or their possible transformation. And as I said, I'm not interested in reconstructing this as the kind of unified world history that Hegel himself envisaged, but to take this as a model for social transformation, a crisis-driven model for social transformation that might still orient us today while getting rid of this kind of Eurocentrism from which Chakrabarty rightfully says it places the rest of the world in some kind of the waiting area of history. As we can see, the Hegelian model of dialectic development lays the ground for a dynamic understanding of history while constituting a particularly demanding interpretation of social and historical processes of transformation. To say that it is demanding is also to say it comes at some theoretical costs and builds on implications we might be reluctant to share, as I already mentioned. Nevertheless, Hegel's philosophy of history, despite its notorious problems, will ultimately provide us with a rich, or so I argue, and productive way of conceptualizing the emergence and erosion of social institutions, practices, and forms of life, that is, social transformation, crisis, and change. It will also enable us to make sense of what Joshua Cohen has called ethical explanations, and a certain way in which the normative and the functional are intertwined here. So it seems to me especially rich and fruitful in Hegel's explanation of social transformation are the following aspects. First, his understanding of crisis and erosions applies not only to their subjective, but also to their objective dimensions. Whatever role the unhappiness, suffering, outrage, and disagreement of social actors play within processes of social transformation, and I don't mean to underestimate this role, but only to highlight another dimension, Hegel allows us to focus on the preconditions for these individual or collective departures as well. In this way, Hegel anticipates Marx's important insight that social changes or revolutions are dependent on a passive as well as on an active element. Secondly, at the same time, this dynamic of crisis is already normatively laden. Crises, as the Hegelian analysis allows us to see, are not purely functional. On the contrary, the moments of dysfunction, instability, and institutional erosion are themselves the effects of normative expectations and the self-understanding of a given social formation. If it would be wrong to conceive of social transformations in an idealistic manner, namely as the unrelated emergence of new ideas and the giving in to the better idea, the functionalist alternative is equally misleading. To put it another way, crisis and the process of transformation have to be understood in what I refer to as a normative functional manner. If Hegel's account then convincingly shows that the stability of social formations is always normatively imbued, then what comes into view is arguably an interesting and historicized version of, I already mentioned it, what Joshua Cohen, among other thinkers, has called an ethical explanation. This is a position that, as Cohen has it, cites ethical norms in explaining why some specified social facts obtain, where these norms are offered in explanations of social facts, not only in appraisals of them. The wrongness, or more tentatively said, normative inadequacy of a social institution then plays a role in its demise. My subsequent interpretation will not take on the burden of defending this in an exhaustive manner, yet the parallels between Hegel's approach and the claims implicit in this concept of ethical explanations might shed some light on both, and therefore on the systematical project of a normative functionalism, or a functionalist but not reductionist understanding of the social. In my paper, I would like to investigate Hegel's approach and with some critical detachment defend it by critically reconstructing it in a somehow pragmatist spirit. If history is the result of crisis-driven dynamics, it is also a history of the emergence and eventual solving of problems, as I take it. It is helpful to confront the somewhat more complex Hegelian picture here with a pragmatist account in order to discuss its advantages as well as its philosophical burdens. Several things are already clear when it comes to the detachment. I already mentioned that I'm not following Hegel in addressing history as universal world history. Actually, I'm interested in understanding it in a way that gives us philosophical tools for a, let's say, deflationary view on those crises and transformation, and also in a view that is not bound up with the idea of the one and only path in history. I will proceed here in two steps. I will first spell out how Hegel's specific understanding of problems and crises as practical contradictions works, and try to solve some of the problems with this understanding, which then will lead me to argue against at least part of what is at stake in the accusation of teleology. In the second part, I'm going to spell out the dynamics of this process of change. And again, I'm interested here in spelling out how Hegel's idea of a continuity in discontinuity makes sense without buying into an idea of history as something that is merely unfolding, or an unfolding of a principle without contingency, or the fact that innovation, something new, might come in as at stake. So with and against Hegel, I try to develop an alternative, which is also an alternative way to conceive of progress within his history, that allows us to conceive of his idea as a freestanding and crisis-driven process that is not merely an unfolding of the already given, but at the same time takes into account the complicated relation between what I have called earlier, referring to Marx, the active and the passive dimensions here. First part, so crisis as a dialectical contradiction. So the specific kind of crisis that we can conceive of with Hegel, the specific kind of normative crisis that I think is bound up with a certain idea of contradictions and problems that take the forms of contradiction. So if we were to draw up a short formula for the primary characteristics of a Hegelian interpretation of the problems and crises that initiate the dynamics of history, it might look like this. For Hegel, problems take the form of contradictions. In a given social and historical situation, they do not appear to be contingent or external disturbances, but rather the manifestation of tensions and crises that were already implicitly present in the situation itself. This is also what allows us in terms of crisis theory to talk about latent as well as about actual crisis. At first glance, the symptoms of a situation's tendency toward crisis are its inconsistency, disruptions, or lack of vibrancy. A historical formation is prone to crisis if it is characterized by tensions and conflicts or states of division that cannot be overcome from within. I will now spell out different dimensions of this understanding. The first one is the immanent character of the conflicts at stake. Well, an everyday conception of problems present them as unforeseeable and contingent occasions for learning, as externally produced material obstacles to action, or as interruptions that impede the functioning of a specific social practice. For Hegel, the contradiction that leads to crisis is not external to the discovered constellation. According to this understanding, it is not the case that what is intrinsically or previously stable becomes unstable, what is coherent becomes incoherent, or what is certain becomes uncertain. Rather, the formation or gestalt that is being challenged is itself characterized by the tensions and potential conflicts contained within it. Every historical and social constellation that is hereby challenged is, so to speak, the provisional, necessarily unstable specification of a problem or contradiction. Strictly speaking, it doesn't run into a contradiction, as we might be suddenly confronted with a problem, but rather it is made up as a contradiction itself. The contradiction that races toward crisis is constitutive for the corresponding formation itself. Let's now look more closely at what characterizes the interpretation of crises and problems in terms of contradictions. First, for Hegel, problems present themselves as conflicts between irreconcilable claims. In itself, this is a very specific interpretation of the concept of crisis or problem, distinct from the idea that a problem consists in some simple knowledge deficit or inability. But even more decisive here is the fact that these conflicts are not conflicts between two unconnected or opposing forces. The conflicts that are challenged do not only come about through the simultaneous onset of two contrary claims. Rather, these claims are linked to one another, and that is precisely what makes up the immanent character and the systematic constitution of the conflict. The victory of human law over divine law, as we find it in Antigone, therefore produces its, I quote, inner enemy, consisting in that which is in that which it represses and which is likewise essential to it. So it finds its inner enemy that consists in which it represses and which is likewise essential to it. It must therefore be learned that its greatest right is its greatest injustice, its victory is instead its own defeat. Sein höchstes Recht, sein größtes Unrecht. Problems in the guise of this understanding of contradiction are then problems that are found systematically within a given social formation, are created by those formations themselves, and cannot be resolved within them at the same time. Hence, Hegel's crisis diagnosis of crisis described the ruin of certain ethical formations as somehow homemade. The historical constellations that he diagnoses as crisis-prone don't just fail, they are the reasons for their own failure. The imminent development of problems described here, however, would be unconceivable without a second aspect. Problems are reflexively interpreted as internal contradictions. This is also where a specifically normative dimension comes in. Imminent contradictions exist only to the extent that cultural forms of life are, in a manner analogous to Charles Taylor's self-interpreting animals, that are self-interpreting entities. They therefore fail unto themselves, not only because they create practices and institutions that contradict one another. More importantly, they fail unto themselves because they contradict their own self-conception, their own interpretation of the world, and the validity claim, the normative claims that comes along with it. The fact that a form of life can be in conflict thus presupposes that it has its own ground of validity, such that the meaning and the normative reference points that are set with and by it can be called into question. This explains the fact that forms of life can, in a way, internally erode, or even that such an erosion, attributable to internal inadequacies, is the precondition for its actual failure. Greek morality did not break down because there was a Socrates who set himself apart and took a critical stance towards it. It broke down because it had to learn from him that it could not meet its own standards. Similarly, in the analysis of civil society that Hegel gives in his philosophy of right, it is not the fact of poverty that leads to the crisis-prone character of civil society or puts it at risk of, I quote, destroying itself and its substantial concept in the act of enjoyment. Rather, crisis follows from the fact that this reality contradicts society's own self-understanding, according to which the individual can find honor and substance through participation in it as labor. So the rebel is not only poor and devastated, it is outraged, but even this outrage is somehow produced by the objective mismatch between society's self-interpretation and its existing practices and institution. This is where the idea of ethical explanation comes in, and this is also where we find some, I think, fruitful tools for social analysis. So a third characteristic arises from this internally contradictory structure, the constitutive productive character of the crisis that Hegel describes. Contradiction and crisis do not only indicate the decline of a particular historical or intellectual formation. While unfolding the dynamic, they are also the driving force that leads out of those dynamics, an aspect of the vibrancy of such a formation. If such a historical form is determined or characterized by a characteristic tension or constellation of problems that, where applicable, develops into a crisis that can no longer be resolved within that formation, then crises are as such not purely destructive. Put another way, the contradiction that characterizes a situation is not only a problem with a negative impact, it is also the force that drives the situation beyond itself. If now, to paraphrase Hegel again, the liability to crisis is the source of further progress as well as of the undoing or destruction of a given formation, those crises are not an abstract deficit. Those social arrangements would be not what they are and could not play their world historical role, overcoming one-sided and unproductive paradigms without their inherent and potentially destructive contradictions. The development of contradictions therefore becomes the mark of the development dynamics of the historical social world, and moreover of the vitality in all of its phenomena. Interestingly then, dynamic social change and not stability is the default mode of a healthy social formation. Further, the crucial question is no longer why and how a purportedly stable situation changes. What interests us now is rather the character and shape of this very dynamic. And as for progress, progress is seen as change within change, a certain kind of change within change. This interpretation of contradiction as essentially constitutive and systematic points to another trait. Contradictions are objective in the sense that the contradiction also resides in the object itself. Objective crises reside in an institutional and practical structure that is alienated from and at odds with itself, and this is due to the existence of conflicting principles within itself. They are then interpreted as characteristic of the social reality itself. That is exactly why Hegel's theory of social crisis, Hegel's normative theory of social crisis, does not restrict itself to grasping the existence of an open social conflict. What can become the problem for us, the relationship that we oppose, must have already become latently problematic on the side of the object or the side of, so to say, reality. If with his interpretation of problems as contradictions now, and I'm going over to evaluating this concept of contradiction. So if with his interpretation of problems as contradictions, Hegel accepts various explanatory burdens, it is, however, still, as I argue, an attractive concept for understanding social crises and processes. One of the decisive lessons Hegel provides us with here is his normative understanding of social crisis. That is the idea that it is the interconnection or entanglement of functional and normative shortcomings by which social forms of life are plunged into crisis. Social crises are always also normative crises. There's no such thing as a purely functional crisis in the realm of the social, no dysfunctionality as such. This is due to the existence and the role that self-interpretations and normative self-interpretations play for the process of transformation and crisis. So no dysfunctionality as such, no social order is dysfunctional, or no social institution is dysfunctional as such, but dysfunctionality as it is intertwined with normative failures. But the opposite is true as well. The normative shortcomings and deficits of a social order present themselves as functional deficits or lead into functional deficits as well. This is what you might call a Hegelian version of normative functionalism. Neither the normative side nor the functional side is freestanding, they're intertwined. And it comes very close to the demands set up with Joshua Cohen's ethical explanations, demands that, as I will argue later, Cohen himself, or Cohen's conception himself fails to meet, while they could be met with a little help from Hegel. This perspective enables us to analyze certain kinds of social erosion, one-sidedness and impoverishment, which can be seen as preconditions of failure. The fact that social practices and institutions, forms of life, are plunged into crisis means not only that something is not working or that a practice can no longer be reproduced in a customary way. It means that a practice can no longer coexist within a certain normative self-conception and the nexus of practices that accompanies that interpretation of the world. Put another way, it means that something is wrong with the respective set of practices or form of life. It has become incoherent, turned out to be impractical, and, as Terry Pinkert puts it, inhabitable for functional as well as normative reasons. But there are also difficulties, besides of this attractive social and normative conception of a social crisis. There are also difficulties attached to the Hegelian interpretation of problems as contradictions. The insistence on the imminence of the crisis gives rise to the question of whether this idea can do justice to the fact that historical constellations sometimes simply end up in something unforeseeable under conditions which are hardly self-imposed. So here the question of historical contingency comes in. Isn't it often the case that external influences, confrontations with foreign practices, as well as coincidental constellations and contingent results cause a form of life to become problematic or lead to conflicts? An interpretation that is limited to a dynamic that is both internal and motivated by internal contradictions, hence leaving no room for the development of new contradictions or contingent problems, would then be too internal and self-immersed to cope with this feature. Consequently, it does not allow for what is interpreted as the material character of problems, and thus hampers its ability to account for a problematic reality in the moderate sense of the world. So can the strength linked to the Hegelian conception of problems and crises as contradictions be salvaged while overcoming the implausible aspect at the same time? I will outline two interrelated proposals here. First, on the one hand, the alternative between problems from without and immanent problems can be avoided if problems pertinent to forms of life are understood as reflexively experienced problems of the second order. What is crucial here is not what caused the problem or whether the cause is internal or external to the form of life, as in the case of problems triggered by confrontations with other forms of life, with nature, or with other contingent events. What is crucial is the level at which the problem becomes a problem. The fact that forms of life confront their own problems does not necessarily mean that they create them. It only means that they can only become problems for a form of life by way of their appropriation, by embracing the problems as problems, which again has something to do with the self-understanding of the social order in question. Framed as a problem of a second order, an external cause of conflict or an external obstacle to action is a genuine and that is immanent problem, or becomes an immanent problem for a form of life, when the latter does not possess the institutional or social resources to cope with it. For an agrarian society, the fact that it hasn't been raining might cause a first order problem. People are starving. The second order problem, though, that might be involved is the lack of resources to deal with this problem, as building storages would be, for example. If the first order problem has its cause outside of the social formation in question, it is contingent and beyond its influence, the second order problem is still immanent or self-made, leading us to the question of the structural obstacles for coming up with solutions, or with better institutions here. But then the crucial aspect, I mean, I think we can observe this connection and relation between first and second order crisis very well with respect to the pandemic situation. But then the crucial aspect is not that the problems that trigger crisis must come from within, but that, unlike catastrophes or mere operational disruptions, they only exist insofar as the challenge initially coming from outside is reflected by the corresponding form of life in some way. The contradiction would in such cases be one that is not always there already, but that develops through the confrontation with challenges wherever they come from. The principle of immanent problem development can then incorporate the confrontation with what might be seen as the outside. The emergence of new kinds of phenomena, of crisis triggering events, is the impact of a contingent problem on a latently contradictory constellations by means of which those contradictions become manifest. My second thesis connects to this claim directly. In order to make this Hegelian understanding of problems productive, the relationship between contradiction and conflict must be reconsidered. The contradiction and the objective side of a crisis must first be actualized in a conflict that is made into a crisis within the realm of the social. A contradiction can erupt, but it does not erupt necessarily. As history and the history of crisis theory shows, formations of the social world that are labeled contradictory sometimes persevere for astoundingly long times. The process of actualization of contradiction must therefore be taken seriously as a process in its own right. The contradiction as the objective side of a crisis, therefore, has its corresponding subjective side. Precisely because it is reflexively interpreted as a contradiction in light of validity claims, of normative claims, it must also be asserted, brought into prominence by social actors, and thus turned into a conflict by them. Social conflict would then be structured through the internal contradiction, but not caused by it in a deterministic sense. Conversely, social actors engaged in a conflict must respond to that very structural dimension. At any rate, an important insight, again, of the Marxian theory of revolution, with its typical ambiguity between class struggle and historical materialism, can be summarized in this way. It must respond to the structural dimension, but at the same time, it has to turn this into a conflict. Therefore, the fact that a crisis must first be actualized as a conflict does not mean that it would be useless to inquire into and analyze the contradictions immanent to social reality or the passive side of the conflict. One does not understand a conflict correctly, and moreover, responds clumsily to it once one loses the perspective of the systematic contradictions, which is what I've tentatively called the objective side of the crisis here. We thus approach an answer to the problem of contingency that was raised previously. If social crises are dependent on the fact that they erupt and become realized in conflicts, then neither they nor the contradictions that give rise to them are strictly necessary. They are not necessary causal effects of a particular situation, nor are the aforementioned kinds of circumstances. However, to refine the connection between crisis and conflict a bit further, the absence of a sudden conflict or discussion of conflicts, hence the absence of collective discussion about forms of life that are becoming problematic, have consequences in case of doubt. We can therefore claim that a failure to actualize latent crisis leads to ideology and other impediments to social learning, that is, to specific forms of social unreason or irrationality or regression. Having discussed now the specific kind of problems and crises that inform and initiate the historical dynamics of change, we must now consider the specific dynamic arising from the unfolding of social contradiction. My aim here again is to detach Hegel from superficial versions of teleology, as in what I call the trophy version of history as having aims in the final end, and the version of theology that accuses him of merely unfolding the immanent telos without human action and contingency. When we are confronted with a problem or a crisis, the relevant possibilities for action at first seem to be blocked. We do not know how to proceed. Something taken for granted suddenly becomes strange. A familiar activity is stalled, we pause, well-established interpretative patterns fail, or a commonly used frame of reference is out of joint. Where do we look for the resources to overcome the problem in such a situation? How does one get from here to there, from the problem or crisis to its solution? And likewise, how can a form of life overcome the crisis it was plunged into? The crucial twist that Hegel gives to the understanding of such processes of transformation can be described as follows. The dynamic erosion and failure of ethical formations, as well as the resulting process of transformation, appear to be a continuum in which the problem that is grasped as a problem, as a conflict, already contains the resources for its own solution. That is to say, Hegel regards the dynamic not as a matter only of discontinuity and innovation, but as the production of solutions in terms of a certain kind of continuity between the old and the new, a continuity within discontinuity. Given the idea that forms of life do not merely stumble into contradictions, and given the idea that the contradictions are constructive, this kind of dynamics is as attractive as it is at the same time problematic, and again with respect to the question of how does the new, how does contingency, how does innovation come in here. So how exactly should we understand this continuity of the problem and its solution, the complex interlocking of the old and the new, from which also the normative character of the proposed of this process is dependent. First, the old constellations that does not suddenly and contingently become irrelevant. It erodes, its validity claim is undermined. It no longer corresponds to the problem it poses. Conversely, the practices, convictions, and demands resulting from the transformation process were in some way already anticipated. This is the Hegel continuity idea within the old constellations. Their presence has already contributed to its decline or obsoleteness. The new constellation is therefore not completely new. If the principle of freedom is in effect the principle of Greek ethical life, and simultaneously what transcends the latter, then the disappearance of Greek ethical life due to an inherent potential of the old formation, which is the source of its decline, becomes both possible and necessary. Thus, the new situation feeds on the inherent potentials of the old, on capacities the previous order has generated, but to which it no longer corresponds. Therefore, the unsustainable situation which has been overcome contained in negative form the resources for its own transformation. In the crisis of the old formation, the potential for productively overcoming it is already given. That which causes the crisis also provides the means to its solution. So goes the story, and it is obvious, again referring to Marx, that his idea that this has been absorbed in his image of the new society having, I quote, matured in the womb of the old society itself, born out of the old. But if this phrase suggests a misunderstanding of history as a quasi-natural process of maturation, we also have to free Hegel's idea here from this idea of a quasi-natural development. We now have an idea what we stand to gain from Hegel's description, but we also have an idea of the burdens that come with it. This idea of a rational process of learning and accumulation, which can systematically be characterized as increasingly sophisticated descriptions of and solutions to problems, and hence, as it were, progress. The fact that new paradigms do not emerge in isolation, but instead as responses to the inadequacies of the old ones, allows us to understand the paradigm shifts Hegel regards as rational. The sequence of paradigms is not random. It might, in a certain sense, be considered motivated. This robust conception of a rational or progressive transformational dynamic also allows us to systematically identify pathological cases. In fact, not only can Hegel explain why some self-conceptions, together with the institutional practices associated with them, are anachronistic and inadequate, his theory also helps us understand the systematic relationship between these self-conceptions and practices on the one hand, and their social effectiveness on the other. They do not randomly emerge, rather they are systematically generated. Thus, learning blocks are essentially ideologies, and pathologically unfolding learning processes are regressive reactions to broad problems for which we must and can find other solutions. Social learning blocks are then not unexpected obstacles, but rather systematically induced regressions. But again, however, Hegel's idea of a determined progression of problem solving has certain, even in this already somehow deflationary version, has certain disadvantages as well. Parallel to the imminence of the concept of contradiction I criticized earlier, integrating unexpected, new and possibly conflicting experiences into a process conceived along these lines may not be possible, and we may not be able to fully accommodate the unpredictability of transformational processes. Even if we understand the complex of problems we are confronted with as determined and as eliciting a specific response, the dynamic of its dissolution is not automatically ensured, and it cannot be directly and straightforwardly predicted. If progression must contend with contingent events and constellations again, and also with the existence of what one might call resistance from reality, of what might be described as the materiality of the world, which confronts us and which is not already ours. Even if the potential to overcome a problem may in some way be already inherent in it, this neither provides us with a ready-made roadmap of further developments, nor does it necessarily mean that the dynamic in question will in fact take place. It seems again that Hegel's dialectical conception of a continuous discontinuity is too narrow in certain respects. More importantly, then, we need to work out what distinguishes Hegelian transformation processes characterized by continuity within discontinuity from an organic process of maturation, and from what Dewey, criticizing Hegel, calls a mere unfolding of the already given, which is one version of an immanent teleology that is at stake here. In what follows, I will attempt again to develop a plausible account and give some kind of solution in order to, with and against Hegel, detach him from this accusation of teleology and merely unfolding of an already given. First, I will suggest a performative constructivist understanding of this process. Then I will sketch a conception of a learning process that integrates a pragmatist trial and error approach to the problem solving. I will start by going back to Hegel's famous phrase, according to which world history is progress of the consciousness of freedom. It is not, as I argue, the goal of this process freedom, the guarantee of its rationality, and the approximation of this goal, the indicator for normative progress. But then again, progress would not be what I take it to be, namely a somehow freestanding accumulative process, but something that is just the path to some pre-established goal. And this is exactly what I don't think it is and don't want to be arguing with Hegel's idea of accumulation here. Does not Hegel hold that comprehending the necessity of this process, though, is the task of the comprehension? So first, I suggest that freedom here should not be understood as a substantial goal. Freedom is not just a good that one strives for and that stands as a goal at the end of history. History does not move towards a goal that can be conceived as the finishing line of an obstacle course, where freedom is handed over to the winner like a golden cup or a trophy. Instead, history as a progress of the consciousness of freedom, as I argue, means that we develop an insight into the preconditions of our own practices, an insight mediated through the experience of crisis. The realization of the consciousness of freedom in history can thus be interpreted as the insight into something that objective spirit implicitly, essentially in itself already is. This is a process of practical self-awareness, an increasing awareness of those qualities that constitute oneself, but which, precisely as that which constitutes oneself, have to be actualized first. So the clue here is the idea that actualization, and this is again some kind of a constructive interpretation of what actualization and realization means, not only that it includes the moment of self-awareness, so it is not that we suddenly develop over the course of history that we are free, but this the interpretation that accompanies this development changes the our very way to inhabit the world. So it's not, and let me skip here over some of those interpretations. So the idea is actualization is an itself productive process. What is made explicit here is not, the way in which something, namely the fact that we are free, and this is how Hegel argues for a certain strain of progress within world history. So the idea is not that we suddenly find out that we are free as we would find out about a fact about us, but it is something that is interwoven with self-understanding. So making this explicit change is something with respect to our relation to the world. It's not like laundry that we take out of the washing machine, but it is something that in itself drives the process of transformation. So it is then not something that is new when we find out that we are free. It's not something that is new in the sense of adding new facts to some corpus of knowledge. And this is why Hegel says nothing new comes into being here. But at the same time, it is new because it is the beginning of a process in which something new occurs, in the sense of that we are somehow taking over a certain position towards us and the social world that then will be able to create something new. So only then if something actually happens in this process of learning, will what I have to refer to as a dialectic learning process actually be a learning process? So this kind of, which leads me to the second step, the second attempt to deflate Hegel's model, or to help him by introducing some pragmatist trial and error moments here. This is something that can be illustrated, and I'm coming to an end soon, don't worry, that can be illustrated by referring to the much debated role of the world historical individual. So the world historical individual is someone who brings in something new into the course of history. And the way Hegel describes the role of the world historical individual, and again, reference to Marx, I take it that the proletariat in Marx has the same systematic position as Hegel's world historical individual has, the proletariat as a group, of course. So when Hegel says here that such individuals, the world historical individuals, have no consciousness of the general idea they were unfolding while prosecuting those aims of theirs. On the contrary, they were practical political men. But at the same time, I quote, they were thinking men who had an insight into the requirements of the time, what was ripe for development. So the interesting thing here is the ambiguity with respect to the world historical individuals. They are at the same time those who bring in something new. They transform the old circumstances, lay out new conditions by way of their actions. They are revolutionaries, creating something new, but at the same time, in playing this role, they seem to be simply servants of the zeitgeist of their historical situation, or indeed of the truth for their age or for their world, as Hegel says. So they act, but they act because they had an insight into the requirements of the time, what was ripe for development. Their actions accord with these insights, and they merely bring out what was already formed in the womb, we could say. They are simultaneously active and reactive. But if history depends on the actions of individuals, while at the same time effecting change through them, then its course seems to be simultaneously contingent and non-contingent. What happens historically depends on the contingent appearance of certain individuals, on their actions and decisions, and on the outcome of actions and decisions which they cannot fully determine or control. This tension between active and passive moments, between freedom and determinism here, can be resolved by stating that we are dealing with the realization of possibilities inherent in a situation, possibilities that are not always actualized and that can in fact remain unactualized if the relevant constellation is somewhat adverse to it, or if there is a lack of world historical individuals. This is where we gain from the integration of a trial and error mechanism into the dialectical process that can be put into use. World historical individuals are those who end up doing the right thing at the right time, who capture and channel the tendencies and trends of their age or respond to them in a way that allows others to follow suit. It could be that world history makes use of a number of such individuals, those who prove themselves to be great, to be the ones who willed and accomplished that which met the case and fell in with the needs of the age, as Hegel says, precisely by successfully and consequentially intervening in history. The same is true of these individuals' decisions to act. They too proceed by way of a modifying reaction, as we would say in terms of trial and error. Of the various possible ways of bringing the inherent potential of a situation to fruition, only some are promising, and we cannot anticipate which. Acting as a world historical individual then means choosing one of many possibilities and letting it take effect. We are then confronted with the results of our action, which can turn out to be productive in one way or another, or remain inconsequential, and that have to be readjusted in reaction to the actual results and side effects. It is this principle that is capable of accounting for contingencies, unexpected experiences, the role of human actions, and the resistance of the material world, and the unexpected consequences of our own actions that then have to be readjusted. I'd like to conclude now by reviewing several of my major claims. I have argued that Hegel's philosophy of history, despite of its obvious shortcomings and problems, contains some fruitful insights for understanding the erosion and transformation of social practices and institutions, and for understanding the latter as the result of the former, as well as the fruitful insight into the normative character of social crisis. I've tried to detach Hegel from the accusation of teleology by tentatively developing a solution to the problems of innovation and contingency that seem to afflict Hegel's account. They have argued that the rationality of the historical process should be understood as freestanding in some sense. It is not depending on a pre-existing telos, and it's not depending on pre-established norms, but developing this normativity and the direction to proceed while doing. Freedom has therefore to be understood as the moving principle, not as the already established goal of this process. So coming back to my initial thesis and the context of my investigation, if my aim has been to dispense with those criticism of the teleology assumptions and the problem of contingency, namely the assumption that a philosophy of history relies on some kind of final end and that it develops by mere unfolding of a given tendency, my version of a crisis-driven accumulative progress is not depending on the unified version of the one and only path of and within history that is so problematic. There's no reason why we couldn't, with and against Hegel, pursue a non-Eurocentric, path-dependent and plural idea of progress here while holding on to progressiveness as a criterion for emancipatory social change. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Rahel. This is fabulous, really incredibly rich talk that gives us a lot of food for thought and really gets at the core of the theme of the conference, which is thinking of crisis and utilizing Hegelian means of thought. So we have quite a bit of time for discussion and comments. Andy first, then Jean-Philippe and Simon.
Thank you, Rahel. It was a great talk. You referred in your talk to social formations a number of times, sometimes to forms of life. It seems to me, I mean, I could rattle off half a dozen countries or social projects which are in crisis, but it seems to me what we are facing at the moment is a world crisis. And I mean, what I've written about world crises, or the world crisis at the moment, I come up against the criticism of Andy, that what are you talking about? This is different in every country and different for every social layer. Now, that's an easy question, easy critique to respond to in relation to one social formation. I was wondering how you translate these ideas into the situation of we are presently in 2021 in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, and thanks so much to pointing out the fact that we are in a world crisis. I mean, I have argued that with Hegel we can go for that it's not necessarily tied to this kind of, there is one path within world history that leads to one distinctive goal. And that is, of course, in order to make way for this kind of plurality of, I mean, the path-dependent plurality of possible crisis and crisis-driven processes. But I don't think that, I mean, this is so to say the first step, and it's a necessary step in order to get rid of a position that is neither historically nor from the point of view of a social theory very plausible. But I don't deny that there's, I mean, as a second step, and this will get me back to your idea of a world crisis, there are, of course, all those crises might be entangled. They are partly dependent on each other. So the idea is to open up the field in order to give way for, as I said, path-dependent ways into crisis, or way I mean, progress is then, of course, only the criteria from which to judge a certain crisis. Path dependent means that if we can talk about about accumulative processes that are marked by this kind of problem solving dialectic, then it all depends on where you start. I mean, in a certain situation, a certain answer can be adequate that wouldn't be in another situation. So this is the path dependency that still allows for arguing with an accumulative process. So not like throwing the baby out of the bathwater by just buying into some idea of contingency that I find less and less plausible, I have to say. So I really think we need to develop a theory that allows for a certain but not deterministic take on the logics in the plural of history. But this means that starting from this plural idea of progresses and crises, the next step would be to see how those are entangled, how they inform each other, how we can at the same time allow for a dynamics of their own. I mean, this is what is at stake here, whether those tendencies have a dynamics of their own, whether they're, or how the relation between, let's say, exogenous and indigenous or endogen transformation process have to be conceived. So the world crisis that you are talking about may as well not be just the unified one and only crisis that has like one logic and also one, let's say, turning point, but it is a multiplicity of crises that develop on their own as well as that they hang together. So the methodological idea is somewhat the same as in certain strands of global history, where those different paths in the way they interact with each other, as well as let's say, histories and narratives and learning processes of their own right, are conceived of their own right. So it is like we start from the plurality and then we see how those hang together. And there might even be, I mean, I would even leave out or leave open the opportunity to have not exactly the master narrative, but there might be strands within this history that are dominating. I mean, just as a matter of fact, not because they are normatively better than the other, but they are, I mean, in fact, they are dominating and influencing those, the other crises and also the other paths of development, of learning experience and so on. So again, I would go for both. There might be a world crisis, but the world crisis also consists of multiple crises on different levels that are path dependent while they are seriously dependent on each other at the same time.
I got Jean-Philippe, Simon, Sebastian, and then John Gramley. Jean-Philippe first.
Yes. Hi, Rahel. Thank you very much for your paper. And it's wonderful that you could give a keynote to a little Australian conference. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And I apologize for the bad quality of the lighting where I am. It's night here in Sydney, and the lighting is terrible in where I'm sitting. So apologies for that. So
I already said to Heike, I assumed that in Sydney it's always, the sun is always shining, you're always hanging out at the beach, which is why I would rather be with you now than here in Berlin, but obviously it's not the case.
So we're having a terrible summer so far. I mean, it's very wet here in Sydney. So I wanted to ask a kind of a critical question. Obviously, you know, Hegel's very substantive narrative of freedom is very problematic for today, of course. But if you think about it in kind of what we're trying to get at, or what we're trying to achieve with going back to Hegel for critical theory, this narrative of freedom seems to me gives something that if you don't use it, you might be facing a problem for an idea of progress or an evaluation of social change. Because just because a form of life faces an inner contradiction and therefore is forced to change does not mean that we can actually, intuitively call it a learning process with the positive connotations of the term. My question to you would be, how do you conceptualize regressions, historical regressions? And I think it's a very important question today, because what we're facing in the face of climate change threats is all kinds of crises all around the world, which have serious regressive features. There are cultural regressions and political regressions, democratic regressions. In Europe, as you well know better than me, but I try to follow the news from afar, we have a rise of returns to authoritarian, conservative, hyper-nationalistic ideologies. And from the point of view of the conservatives, they would accept your model at the formal level. They will say, yes, we did have this contradiction whereby we had these terrible modernist or globalized ideologies, and thankfully now we are returning to the good old ways. So, in France at the moment, my country of birth, you have this guy who is now running for presidency, who say things that are absolutely atrocious, incredibly regressive about women, about people with non-French sounding names, about homosexuals. I mean, it's incredible. And it's all over the world, of course, all over Europe. And there's a democratic crisis. So my point is, a purely formal model of progress that is just about how, a form of life is faced with its own contradictions and somehow just go through the crisis and learn from it, that doesn't seem enough. If you don't add the external criterion of, well, just to be very crude, is there more or less freedom after the crisis? If you don't add that, then you might be, then first of all, as a critical theorist, when are you entitled to say, well, this was actually regressive, or the crisis led into a regressive form of development or whatever? And how do you counter a conservative narrative that would say, no, we had a crisis and now it's better because we're back to the past?
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. I mean, my first inclination would be to answer with a Adorno's citation on regression, where he says there is no such thing as returning to the good old ways. That always betrays where it wants to get at. And I think there's some besides again some problematic parts in the Adornian idea of regression. There are really interesting insights too. I mean, I've been working on regression for a while now, and it's an interesting. There's some interesting insights, even in the most problematic, like when he talks about jazz as regressive and so on. So, but in order to understand the structure of regression, this is interesting. So let me start from here. So in my my concept of regression here is that regression is a certain way to not be able to confront crisis and problems on the level that we are confronted with it. So it's an inadequate reaction to crisis. And now you would say, okay, but who decides what is adequate, what is inadequate? Here, I mean, I have somehow, let's say, realist constructivist, I mean, somehow have the cake and eat both. The pragmatist idea that the problems or that crisis somehow confront us. It's not that we are facing crisis without having to interpret them as a crisis. This is why I insist on the normative character of it. But at the same time, there are things that can only be denied for paying a high price, so to say. And the price is then something that, and this you might still count a purely formal or a too formal approach, but the price can be spelled out by analyzing those moments of denial, those learning blockages, those one-sidedness of the way that people don't even allow reality, I mean, to come in, to confront them and so on. So I think there are, I mean, part of it is what you might call ideologies or epistemic, lack of epistemic resources of some kind. And other ways in which describe how we are somehow practically stuck in a certain situation. And the climate catastrophe provides us with a lot of examples, I would say. So I don't think that my account is purely formal the way you think it is, or that freedom does not play a role. My claim here is that freedom, my attempt here is to argue, and this is, I think, really something that we can do with Hegel here. The idea is that freedom is not a substantial value of some kind, and is not a normative criterion of the external. I mean, you mentioned that we need to have some external criterion, namely freedom, so that to judge whether a process is regressive or not, or a crisis solution is progressive or not, and then we would if I understood you rightly, then we would judge it with respect to, does it enhance freedom or or decrease freedom. In my take on it is that freedom is a moving principle, which is not the same as, so it's not absent in my account, but it is the moving principle. It is something that, and this can be spelled out with respect to what Hegel means when he says, so, I mean, the course of history, we understand we have always been free, but we only, in the process of history, and here's where his terrible Eurocentrism and even racism comes in, so only some people have actually realized that they are free, but everyone is free. And if you pay attention to what's going on here, I mean, this process of actualizing and realizing that one is free, then the interesting thing is that it is a moving principle that is not something, as I argued, it's not the trophy that is handed over to you at the end, and it's also not something that not a substantive increase in certain. It is a mode of self-understanding and a moving principle that is led by and finally leads to the insight that human forms of life are free or subject to self-determination in a sense that is conceptual in some way. So it is just what human forms of life and or what the forms in which human beings live. It is somehow a conceptual point about what we are doing here, if we understand what we are doing rightly. So it's not that freedom doesn't play a role here, but I wanted to play a role where, back to why wouldn't one count getting back to the good old days as progress instead of regression, where one could, by way of spelling out how the fact of freedom is somehow not, is denied with ever so many kinds of ideologies, obstacles, whatever obstacles to those process of experiences I'm talking about. So this is the idea that one would have that regression and progress here is not a substantive notion, substantive in the way of saying we already know the normative goal and progress is just so many steps towards this goal. So this is the kind, I think, that Hegelian and critical theory take on progress should be different, also because it aims at establishing progressiveness, let's say, and regressiveness as criterion and as criteria that are normative on themselves. So what I mentioned in the beginning, that from the broader framework and picture of critical theory, there are only so many ways to solve the problem of normative standards. So one would be a Kantian freestanding way to, freestanding or external way to establish it, which I see as something that is not, that at least in let's say the traditional project of a critical theory has been overcome. And the other version is a broadly relativistic contextualist version that I would argue is, not what is so specific about critical theory as well. So I go for this kind of, imminent left-wing project that, and I think it's worth spelling out how it is linked to a certain idea of normativity in history. And as you all know, there have been, the idea of decolonizing critical theory is exactly connected to overcoming this kind of this idea of a learning process. I think one cannot dispense of this. It's something that is one of the rare possibilities to establish a normative account for a critical theory. And this can only be solved if you try to understand the regressive and progressive moments as something that can be judged as a process itself. So the idea is here, it's not formal it's not formal in a purely proceduralist way, I would say. It is formal, it is processual, but not proceduralist, I would say.
Great. We have 4 people: Simon, Sebastian, John Gramley, and Onni. Let's take the questions in pairs. Simon and Sebastian, please keep them brief.
Thanks. Yeah, I've got a question about learning, and one of the things that's central in your talk today was the role of learning, and I'm trying to make sense of that in relation to the kind of 2 tensions that I see in the philosophy of history. On the one hand, we've got this kind of sense of freedom, which you've described as freedom as a kind of taking over a position on the world. And on the other hand, there's that kind of critical role of second nature in the philosophy of history. And so I'm thinking about, in that sense, the way in which norms get transformed in the philosophy of history through them being uninhabitable. And that requires that the crises are not just, as it were, confronted, but we've got to actually experience them, and that those, as it were, those crises are embodied. And that I'm just wondering if you see that embodied aspect, that necessary kind of second nature aspect is sort of central to this learning, and does that represent a kind of tension in the way in which Hegel thinks about freedom?
Thanks, Simon. Sebastian.
Thanks, Rahel. I don't envy you trying to answer several questions at once, but my question sort of maybe spins off a little bit what Jean-Philippe was saying. I wanted just to sort of go back to your original framing in terms of this being your approach to the philosophy of history being pluralistic, deflationary, non-teleological, non-Eurocentric. And I was wondering whether it's possible to maintain that on the one hand, and on the other hand, to still maintain a commitment to the substantive value of emancipation or the consciousness of freedom. So this is, again, a sort of territory that people have talked about. But I'm interested in this question at really the level of who is the we of the theory. Is it still attempting to speak to humanity is its ambit humanity, which is what the sort of formal frame seemed to be. But when you bring in emancipation, as an anthropologist, I would just have to say it's an empirical fact that emancipation does not have the same kind of cultural salience in different cultural life worlds. And so you just do not have the same kind of consciousness of freedom as the reality of what we are. And so to that degree, I wonder whether you're not smuggling back in some kind of telos and Eurocentrism.
So, yes, thank you so much. So I tried to be brief in my answers because I know that we're at the end already. And first to Simon Lanson, learning and second nature. I mean, actually, one reason why in the German version of the talk I would nowadays always replace learning process by Erfahrungsprozess is exactly this idea. I mean, process of experience. The problem is it doesn't translate into English that well. Learning process just goes grammatically is smoother, but it is a process, an experiential process. Erfahrungsprozess is just, yeah, I mean, easier to say in a better process, but the idea behind pointing out the value of experience here is exactly what you seem to have in mind, that it is not just a cognitive process, but something that needs to be experienced the way that, I mean, the analogy to what is experienced within psychoanalysis might be helpful here. So it has to be experienced in the way that something is not just cognitively accepted, but also what Freud calls worked through. And this is something that has a bodily dimension, that has a dimension of affecting second nature, that has the dimension of emotions, and so on. And if one then wants to talk about learning blockages and blockades, again, it is important to say that those are Erfahrungsblockaden, blockages of experience and not of, and then, I mean, to come up with a rich concept of experience here. This is also a way to make sense of why certain dimensions that cognitively spoken our societies might have learned at the same time do not become effective. So the interesting question is, why don't they become effective? And what has this to do with not only the kind of vocabulary and narrative that is accessible, but also, I mean, the dimensions that you have in mind. So thank you so much for this clarification. But yes, I mean, I'm absolutely on your side here. And this is why I think I was a bit uneasy with I mean, it's more common to talk about learning process. It does sound too much like going to school. So since I'm not a big fan of schools in the classical sense, I would also be happy to get rid of this all too narrow idea of learning here. So the second question, Sebastian Job. Of course, I mean, there's always the danger of smuggling in. I mean, it's a well-known danger and a well-known, let's say, strategy to smuggle in a proceduralist or formalist account, to smuggle in more substantial values than one would accept or lay open. And absolutely, of course, emancipation does not have the same cultural salience or looks differently in different cultures. I think there is some kind of, let's say, I mean, so the accusations, of course, there is some universalist assumption about emancipation and freedom still at stake that wouldn't live up to the pluralist and Eurocentrizing aim of my talk. I think, I mean, this would have to be argued by, I would say at least by going through the kind of cases that you have in mind. My guess is that let's say I'm a bit torn between saying there are some problems that are in some way universal. So there are some problems that human beings need to solve and need to react to. I mean, the basic problem of cooperation seems to me to be something that you don't have to argue. I mean, you don't have to have a strong version or a strong idea of human nature or something, but you can, I mean, just starting from historical facts, which also means I mean, when I talk about problems instead of, for example, human needs or human nature, the idea here is that it doesn't matter where we start from. We start with, a historically specific situation and might have a look at what human beings and the forms of life in which human beings find themselves, how they are dealing with those problems. So I don't need to claim that from the that there is some that there are those universal, substantially universal traits and characteristics that that we could observe in all those attempts to come to terms with, I mean, the reproduction of human and social life. But at the same time, it seems to be safe to say some kind of coordination of cooperation seems to be at stake wherever we look at what the human beings have been done throughout history. And then, of course, the specificity and the diversity of those problems and answers come into play. And I would say it is also safe to say that a lot of problems result from the very fact that that we are free, actually, that it is on us to shape, to gestalten, to not create in the sense of creating from the scratch, but to relate to our environment that is always already human-made environment, a social environment. So I would think this is either a very thin universalism because it allows for all kinds of paths and varieties from that, or it is something that I mean, methodologically spoken, I would try to defend this, I mean, somehow along the lines of the question of the universal crisis as a bottom-up universalism, something like, okay, let's just see, or just having a look at how human beings and societies react to certain challenges and problems. Let's see whether there are some similarities. And I think, I mean, I'm not an anthropologist, but I think that, I mean, just from the very naive perspective of someone who, I mean, like frequently looks at the artifacts that those different cultures produce, there seems to be both. I mean, an incredible variety, but at the same time, some common traits. And I mean, then this is only a starting point, because this is exactly not the way I'm going. I mean, to spell out those common traits and dimensions, then, because this is where my position here starts. Let's just have a look at how, starting from a certain kind of reaction and a certain way to solve the cooperation problem, how those problems and respective solutions and new problems that are a result of the respective solutions, how this works out. Of course, you can still say there is universality smuggled in, or ideal smuggled in, because you seem to assume that there should be some kind of consistency or some kind of rationality in this process. And my answer to this would be that, this is something that is not that we don't impose from the outside. This is something that looking at those traditions, looking at the radical transformations and the crisis we experience, it is one of the moving of the elements of the dynamic itself. And this, I think, tells us something.
I think that's a good place to end. We are already over time. Thank you so much, Rahel, for an incredibly rich talk and really rich discussion. It would be great if we all would be together now somewhere in 3D and would be able to go for dinner after the last sessions. Let's hope we can do that soon. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah, it would certainly be a pleasure. And thank you so much again for inviting me and for this really, really interesting and fruitful discussion. I hope to see you all in person whenever the situation is over. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.